Hello everyone, so I'm Pranshu and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I can see a few people logging in, so we'll just give them a few seconds and then we can get started. We'll just give them some time to set themselves up. All right, so I hope you're all well and keeping safe. I'll just be quickly introducing WalkingTree for anyone joining us for the very first time. WalkingTree Technologies is a technology-focused company with a core focus on designing and building cross-platform web and mobile applications, perform system integrations, and enable digital transformation. We also specialize in data integration, data analytics, migration from legacy to modern systems, cloud migrations, and of course, perform UX design. Apart from end-to-end application development, we also provide custom solutions to enterprises for web and mobile, very specific services within the software development lifecycle, UI UX design. I've already mentioned that, microservices, DevOps, and cloud. Our flexible staff augmentation services provide clients with on-demand skills, resources to meet their organizational and business objectives. Today's webinar, we'll be having two presenters. Pradeep is our co-founder and director here at WalkingTree Technologies. Our second speaker is Akshay, Assistant Vice President, Delivery. And before we start with today's agenda, I would let you all know that we will be answering all your questions towards the end of the session. So please do leave them in the Q&A box. Over to you, Akshay. How are you doing today?
Very good, Pranshu. Thank you so much. All right. So thank you, Pranshu, for the wonderful introduction. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Akshay Srivastav, and I'm associated with WalkingTree Technologies as an Assistant Vice President of Delivery. I have been part of the IT industry for the last 15 plus years, and with WalkingTree since January this year. I have dedicated the last few years of my career in helping shape the agile practices across teams and organizations, essentially owing to my passion for agile. With me today, I have Mr. Pradeep Lavania, who is the co-founder and director of WalkingTree. Pradeep, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, Akshay. Thank you very much, Akshay. Hello, everyone. I'm Pradeep Lavania, co-founder and director of WalkingTree. I'm so immensely thankful for each one of you to spare time for this webinar here today. And I'm also very excited to have this opportunity to share space with Akshay in this session and, of course, all of you. I have been in the IT industry for more than 22 years, where I started my career as a developer. Currently, I find my passion in building high-performing teams and high-profitability businesses. And needless to say, I see Agile mindset as the key to success in many situations. And here I am to share with you all about my learnings and views on anti-patterns in Agile Scrum.
Okay. So before we start talking about the anti-patterns in Scrum, let's talk a little bit about what Scrum is. Now, Agile essentially presents itself as a set of values, as described in the Agile Manifesto, around which there are numerous methodologies that have been coined. Today, we are going to talk about one of the most popular and widely accepted methodologies for iterative development, called Scrum. The word Scrum comes from the sport rugby, where the team self-organizes itself into a huddle formation. And this formation that you see in the image, that is called a scrum. And this huddle formation moves together as a single unit. And this entire process is orchestrated by a referee, the guy you see in the red t-shirt, who's called a Scrum Master. Okay, so this is where the essential idea of Scrum comes from. And in my experience as an Agile coach and evangelist, I have observed several anti-patterns in Scrum, which lead to inefficient execution and eventually unforeseen challenges. So, having said that, today we will try to attempt to shed some light on some of these anti-patterns, talk about some of the corrective actions that can be taken to overcome these challenges. I'm sure a lot of you will be able to relate to some of these anti-patterns, and if you are, this session may be useful for you to go back with some takeaways.
Okay, so here's the agenda for the session. And as part of our agenda today, we'll focus on some of the anti-patterns relating to the events and roles in Scrum, while also deliberating on how we can detect some popular anti-patterns. When we say anti-patterns, typically we are referring to things that are in principle against the expected norm, but still are very frequent and evident in our day-to-day execution. As you can imagine, in my career span of more than 2 decades, more than 50% of it was working with waterfall methodologies. I started learning about Agile, say, some 8 to 9 years ago, and I've come to a point where I believe Agile is a way of thinking and Agile is a lifestyle. While I say that, in my experience practicing Agile, I have time and again come across situations where I see seasoned professionals missing those tiny nitty-gritties that set apart the proficient from the inefficient. We have been coaching our teams within WalkingTree and our customers of WalkingTree on these nitty-gritties repeatedly over the years, and has the idea of evangelizing the same in the session with the hope that it could be helpful for every one of us in our day-to-day practice of Agile and Scrum. While we have limited time in this session, we'll try to scratch the surface and help you have some conscious thoughts about what anti-patterns in Scrum are, and hope that with that consciousness, you'll be able to avoid some of them, if not all. So to cover the ground, we have segregated the anti-patterns relating them to Scrum events and Scrum roles. Entire the life cycle of Scrum can be looked upon as a series of events or ceremonies, if you would, and we will talk about each one of them. For Scrum roles, we look at the Scrum Master, the product owner, and the stakeholders roles, and what are potential anti-patterns possible there. Towards the end, we'll also talk about how does Scrum enable us to detect if we have any anti-patterns in play in our execution. So we have some slides with us, which we will be presenting. And as we go through the presentation, myself and my good friend and colleague Akshay here will take turns to present specific topics. I should tell you that we have worked really hard to prepare ourselves for this, and we are committed to make it an enriching and learning experience for you all. So let us begin with talking about anti-patterns in Scrum events. So Akshay, over to you.
Thank you, Pradeep. So as we start talking about events in Scrum, right? Some people call it events, some people call them ceremonies. But essentially the idea is that we want to understand what some of the anti-patterns on these events are. So starting with the daily Scrum, the purpose of a daily Scrum is essentially for the team to ensure that they are on track, for them to align on the goals for the day and identify any challenges that may need attention. It has to set the tone and vision for what the end of the day should look like, right? Now, while Scrum Alliance does not really advise any set pattern, they used to, but they don't anymore. But the most popular one still remains, what did I do yesterday? What am I doing today? And what are my impediments? Now, in my experience, however, I have seen that most teams consider this a status update, hence are not regular in conducting it every day. Deviating from the very purpose of the daily Scrum, we tend to start problem solving and planning in a daily Scrum, which are some of the most existent anti-patterns with the daily Scrum. What Scrum Masters and product owners need to really understand is that this is not an avenue for establishing command over the daily tasks, but to let the team internally align, right? And establish that alignment within a small size team. Moving on to the product backlog and refinement. When it comes to product backlog and refinement, I have usually seen that teams struggle with an oversized backlog, right? And this oversized backlog is many times focused towards technical requirements rather than functional user stories. Now, as we discovered these challenges through our experience, we realized that having a backlog sized for the next 3 to 4 sprints with enough enablers for research and dependency resolution really helps create a short to mid-term visibility on things. User stories that are horizontally sliced across the skills in the team and which qualify the invest principles, answering the who, what, and why for any requirement, makes it easier for the team to understand the value of any deliverable. For those who are not familiar with the invest principles, it basically describes any user story as independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and testable. So to make it simpler for the team, anything that can be tested independently becomes a user story that is functional in nature and can be independently delivered. Now, this can be achieved by making sure that the entire team participates in the refinement and not just the product owner sitting with the tech leads and the Scrum Masters. The entire team needs to participate in the refinement and establish a common understanding of the complexity and dependencies with a clearly defined definition of ready. Sprint planning. I usually consider this as the most important event of Scrum. And this is one that's responsible for close to 80% of the challenges faced by Scrum teams, if not conducted properly. Pre-requisitioning the sprint planning with correct capacity planning, ensuring 15 to 20% slack or buffer time, creates enough leg room for the team to achieve their goal in case of unprecedented defects or rework. Also, since Scrum is an aggressive and fast-paced delivery approach focused on the functional aspect of any delivery, we as technical teams are bound to introduce some technical debt with every iteration. Hence, it becomes important for us to make sure that we are keeping at least 12 to 15% bandwidth reserved for technical debt, right, in our endeavor to maintain quality. And I have also observed sometimes that many teams plan sprints at a very high level with unfinished items from previous sprints, no detailed breakdown around the required tasks. So what happens, right? We are not conducting it at a granular level. We are not breaking down tasks in detail. And sometimes we even conduct the sprint planning without the participation of the development team, which essentially leads to inaccuracy in effort estimation and eventually unrealistic goals. Coming to the sprint itself. Now, as the team starts with the execution of the sprint plan, one of the most imperative factors is that the product owner, who is considered to be an SME of the product, participates with the team on a daily basis and resolves any functional queries. Also, the team needs to ensure that they are not really sticking to their respective technical comfort zones, and they continue to explore challenges in order to build cross-functional T-shaped skills. Now, the way it helps is it helps in creating backups within the team and eliminates the need to reassign resources in the time of need. So the Scrum team within itself can really self-organize and manage any dependencies or crisis situations. right? Also, sprints, like any event in Scrum, it needs to be scheduled, it needs to be routine, and it needs to be time boxed. We cannot keep changing the sprint length with irregularity. It has to be time boxed, right? Because many times what we do is we keep changing the length of the sprint depending on whether or not we have the sprint goal completed, which is really manipulation of the metrics, and it fails to give us the real picture of how the sprint is performing, right? And another factor that is really important to have that visibility is for the team to have the Scrum board updated at all times, right? As we ensure that the Scrum board is updated to reflect the latest status of the sprint backlog, um, many teams with outdated Scrum boards not only disrupt the performance reporting, but eventually lead to a need for micromanagement of daily tasks. Coming to the sprint review, or as a lot of teams call it, sprint demo. One of the biggest challenges that I have seen with sprint reviews is the team considers this a presentation, right? And with the inherent implication, they start presenting the progress of a product over slides. Now, this is a deviation from the purpose of a review. A sprint review really intends to evaluate the working piece of functionality that can either create immediate value for a stakeholder or trigger feedback for the next piece of the puzzle, right? Therefore, we need to ensure that we are presenting working software that is complete, meets the acceptance criteria, and is adherent to a well-defined definition of done. Having said that, it is again implied that there needs to be scheduled and routine reviews so that early feedback can be incorporated and we don't end up investing in rework due to change in priorities, change in requirements. So early feedback can keep helping us incorporate changes at an early stage. And finally, coming to the sprint retrospective. The biggest anti-pattern with retrospective in my experience is no retrospective. So a lot of teams don't conduct a retrospective and instead end up using that time for finishing last minute tasks for the sprint. And if not that, even rushing through the retrospective just for the heck of it, just because we have to do it, rush through it. And these are something that I have widely observed in my experience with Scrum teams. Now, what we need to really understand here is that the outcome of each retrospective acts as a change agent in a Scrum team's goal to establish an empirical process where we are continuously learning, continuously improving. We should not look at it as a forum to complain, really, or whine about what went through in the last sprint. Rather, it really needs to be a constructive discussion around how can we improve as a team? How can we improve our processes as a team? How can we improve our execution as a team? And even though sometimes there are discussions around what we are doing, the absence of tangible action items with accountable ownership within the team, again, defeats the purpose of a retrospective. And eventually the team loses interest, loses focus, right? Because there's nothing to look forward to, nothing to chase, nothing to take action for. Here, Scrum Masters are really tasked with creating an environment where the team can have objective discussions without the fear of consequences, right? And that is, I think, the biggest and most important factor for a retrospective, that we are having this discussion in an environment where we don't have a fear of consequence. And this is precisely why Scrum Alliance largely discourages the attendance of line managers in a retrospective, as we are not really supposed to consider this as an avenue for performance evaluation for anyone. Okay. So with that, I would like to hand over the stage to Mr. Pradeep Lavania, who would like to share his experiences around anti-patterns with Scrum roles. Over to you, Pradeep.
Thank you, Akshay. I'm sure this was helpful. This was a great insight, talking about the anti-patterns around the events, the Scrum events. I do believe that most of these anti-patterns originate from or relate to the lack of understanding of Scrum roles. And it is important for us to understand how each role fits into the Scrum cog and keeps the moving parts running. Now, in my presentation that follows, I'll talk about some of the anti-patterns that have been widely observed with the product owner, the Scrum Masters, and the stakeholders. I'll not be talking about the development team, since any behavioral aspect at the development team's level is largely driven by how the process shaped by the roles of Scrum Master, product owner, and stakeholders. That's my belief. So we'll skip that part, but yeah, we'll cover the product owner, the Scrum Master, and the stakeholder roles here. So coming to the product owner, we all understand, I'm assuming we all understand what a product owner role is, but any team, Scrum or otherwise, is balanced over three legs of a tripod: the domain, the process, and the technology. I've observed that product owners widely make a mistake and establish themselves as a customer to the development team, and hence end up becoming more like a non-active participant in the process and the team. Now, also responsibilities like prioritization based on value, ownership of the ROI, and management of the backlog as product SME are primary responsibilities of a product owner, which should not be delegated to any proxy. So product owner role has to be functionally performed by a product owner, and his goals are very clear, and they should not be delegated to another person in the team. Now, absence of the product owner in a daily execution progress leads to delay in acceptance, because product owner generally would have that acceptance criteria with himself, and the proxy may not be authorized to accept user stories. Now, in line with what Akshay mentioned about the oversized product backlogs, the product owners need to understand the value of a backlog and not treat it as a dump yard for ideas. So we become very creative while we are executing, and we start creating a backlog which might not be the real backlog for the product, or it might just oversize the backlog and be a distraction more than being a constructive leverage. And last minute changes should not be a part of the product backlog. And every backlog item needs to go through the refinement and planning cycle. Now, Scrum Master role. Someone once told me that the finest trait of a Scrum Master is to kill by kindness. Now, Agile transformation and process change is a mindset shifting task. It's not really like a workflow based or a regular thing. So if you're talking about an Agile transformation and a process change, it needs a mindset shift, which may require the Scrum Master to repeat things many times to the same team in order to implant ideas around the change. And patience and persistence here becomes a key foundation. It is, however, important for the Scrum Masters to understand that Scrum is a framework around which processes are built. So Scrum doesn't mandate enforcement by books. Rather, it encourages followers in a spirit. Scrum Masters should act as change agents who can change processes to suit the team, while making sure that we do not deviate from the core Agile principles. Therefore, creating an environment for support and coaching the team into being self-dependent and organized, while also making sure that internal conflicts are resolved with constructive conversations, vis-a-vis or as opposed to diffusing situations without, and avoiding the hard conversations in order to keep harmony within the team. Scrum stakeholders, so they are a very important set of people who invest in the product, and they conduct business with the team's deliverables. Hence, it is important for them to realize their contribution towards what is being attempted as an outcome of Scrum. The stakeholders are usually invited by the product owner to sprint reviews, to evaluate what has been done and provide early feedback in order to reduce the cost for changes and delays at a later point. Hence, it becomes very, very imperative that the stakeholders do not deviate the review with relevant conversations and keep it focused on productive feedback that can feed into a transparent roadmap for the product. Now, providing the team with a bigger picture or a vision statement or something like that of their deliverable acts as a great motivation factor. But this is by far the only Scrum role that is not a direct part of the Scrum team and needs to be cognizant of the fact that the process is designed to reveal existing challenges and not introduce the new ones. Hence, the stakeholders should refrain from manipulating the process as they see fit in case of a crisis and trust that the Scrum process will help in driving efficient closures. I'm hopeful that by now, going through what we have gone through already, we have established some understanding around what is going wrong with Scrum around the world, and we are ready to take back some inputs to our respective teams and drive more efficiency by eliminating these anti-patterns. But a lot of us will be faced with an inevitable question. Even though we have implemented our learnings from the session, how do we know if we are still exercising any anti-patterns? Is there a check and balance which could indicate the symptoms or which could point us in the right direction to say, that we are still having some anti-pattern? Well, in the next section of the presentation, Akshay will talk about a very underestimated tool within Scrum and how it can help us identify and detect some of the anti-patterns more methodically, more objectively within Scrum execution. Over to you, Akshay.
Thank you, Pradeep. So while I was listening to your presentation, I was just thinking, every individual associated with the Scrum team indeed needs to know their fitment into the team and the expected contribution. And I'm sure your insights will help a lot of people in realizing their importance towards the team. But like you said, a very underestimated tool within Scrum, we do underestimate the power of a burn down chart when it comes to detecting anti-patterns. I have observed that teams usually just look at it like a reporting tool that adds little to no value to the Scrum process. That's what usually the teams are looking at a burn down like. So let's look at some of the signs that we can keep an eye on to identify some of the popular anti-patterns. The first one being late acceptance. So like Pradeep mentioned, the role of a product owner, the product owner's role needs to be engaged with the team on a daily basis. And the absence of an active product owner or the presence of a proxy product owner with no authority on acceptance is going to reflect in the burn down chart, resulting in what we see on the screen. A flat line burn down dropping near the end of the sprint, signifying that the product owner did not start reviewing the user stories until the later end of the sprint. Another sign that we can look out for in a burn down chart is slow progress. Now, what are some of the anti-patterns that this can signify, right? So, like I said, if any team that is too ambitious, taking up tasks that were not fully scoped, or too submissive, taking on anything that was thrown their way by the product owner, will lead to slow progress, as the absence of refinement and planning cycle for any story results in ambiguous effort estimates. So it's important that the sprint backlog is finalized during the sprint planning, and any external dependencies are identified and rostered in schedule during the refinement. The other sign that is usually very evident in the team's burn down charts is scope change. Now, like I mentioned, the sprint backlog needs to be finalized during the sprint planning, right? And changing the scope within the sprint leads to disruption in how the sprint was planned. The changes coming into the sprint may not have gone through the refinement and breakdown exercises like we spoke, hence placing the entire sprint goal into jeopardy. So, while we should at all costs try to avoid any scope changes during a sprint. Having said that, I know what we are thinking, that sometimes there is a dire need to change the scope due to an urgent priority that is coming from the product owner. What do we do then? So if such a situation is to arise, we need to follow the standard scope change process defined by Scrum. Coming to my favorite sign on a sprint burn down, a lot of teams that I've worked with, they take a lot of pride in the fact that we are able to complete the sprint goal before time. And teams are very happy. We planned for 2 weeks, we finished in 1.5. And I'm always thinking this is a serious anti-pattern because early completion every time is something that I need to evaluate. Now, this usually happens when the team is overcautious. Okay. When they are finalizing the sprint plan, the team ends up inflating effort estimates and taking up only enough that can be conveniently completed with an abundant slack time. Eventually, that leads to early completion, of course, but with the entire slack time going unutilized, which is not a best sign to look for on a burn down. So with that, we are done with how to detect anti-patterns with a burn down. So I would here encourage you all to go ahead, start evaluating your burn down charts for any anti-patterns, along with any changes that you may need to be incorporated into your Scrum events and roles. We at WalkingTree have a strong passion towards agility, and we strive for driving efficient execution across our customers and partners. So with that, I would like to request Pradeep to give us a glimpse into Agile at WalkingTree. Over to you, Pradeep.
All right, so thanks, Akshay. So like I mentioned earlier, we have been practicing Agile in WalkingTree for last more than 8 to 9 years. And we have been able to create a very successful team of Agile practitioners within WalkingTree. Now, we are a technology services company, and as a services business, we do offer bringing our Agile practice experience on the table and collaborate with our customers for their success. So from a non-Agile, whatever it is, from a non-Agile to a pure Agile, I think it's a journey. And we have gone through that journey with our customers multiple times. And we have successfully delivered multiple Agile transformation programs in the past, wherein we bring in the coaching, the process implementation and training, and help our customers build strong Agile practices within their teams. There are tangible benefits, when you do Agile, there are tangible benefits that we have been able to deliver to our customers through this practice, and they are easily measured in terms of ROI realization, more effective development and investment plans, well-steered decisions to maximize value. And one of the very beautiful aspects of efficient Agile is, the early benefit realizations. I think that's one of the key things that Agile really enables with any other practice, which is prominent today. Now, we as a company have a very strong program management practice structure as a vertical center of excellence within our team. And that makes WalkingTree a strong technology services company and also a strong team equipped to support any initiatives related to Agile practice. So in short, what we are talking here is something that we have been practicing within WalkingTree. We have seen the value, we have seen our customers benefiting out of it, and hence the idea of coming in this forum and talking about it and hoping for every one of you to be able to leverage what we see here. So thank you. I think that comes to the end of the slides. We can continue to talk, but I guess we've got a few questions to address, so we can pick up those questions now.
Right, yes, we do have quite a few. Starting with one from Maxine. I hope you're all able to see those questions. Is having the lead QA speak for all QA during the daily Scrum an anti-pattern? I find it kind of difficult to gather what the blockers are from one person. While this one QA is pretty good about summarizing what's going on, it doesn't help with visibility into if everyone is working on priority at the moment and any blockers. Sometimes he'll reveal a blocker, but I'm not sure if it accounts for everyone's blockers. It just seems like a weird paradigm to me when it comes to accountability and transparency.
Right. So when we frame our question saying summarizing or speaking for everyone else, it essentially transforms the daily Scrum into a status update, right? What your lead QA is doing on a daily Scrum is providing an update on behalf of the team, which is, yes, a serious anti-pattern. The intent of the daily Scrum is not to gather updates for the team, but essentially for the team to align internally on what our daily goals are, how our dependencies are working with each other, and what is blocking me, right? So every individual needs to have that insight into what did I do yesterday, what am I doing today, and what are my impediments, right? Because every individual's impediments is a dependency to somebody else's tasks. So to answer your question, yes, we should not encourage summarizing updates from a lead QA, but instead every team member should be accountable to provide an insight onto what their daily goal is.
Thank you, Akshay. We have another question from an anonymous attendee. Shouldn't the Scrum board be updated at daily stand-up? How would you have out-of-date Scrum board during sprint?
So the daily Scrum is not a forum for updating Scrum boards. Okay, the Scrum board, essentially, if I am working on a user story and I need to move it from in progress to validation, let's say, that needs to happen when it moves from in progress to validation and not during the daily stand-up. And since that doesn't happen on a regular basis, the Scrum board goes out of date, because the daily Scrum is not the forum where we gather around to update the Scrum board. It needs to happen continuously throughout the day as the user stories traverse through their respective status.
Right, we have another question from Varun. Why is carryover bad? A senior TPM and the EM on our team do not care about carrying over stories from sprint to sprint, bringing in new stories to an existing sprint, or simply taking stories right at the end of a sprint. I know this to be a bad practice, but in order to build my case against these practices, I'm asking for your opinions as to why these things are not good for a team trying to practice Scrum with agility.
Right. So Scrum, if you look at Scrum and the reason why we are working in sprints, right? So we want to really measure effectiveness and efficiency of a team in time box deliverables, right? And carrying over items from previous sprints every time raises a question on, are we not planning our capacity effectively? Are we not really able to envision as a team on what can be accomplished in a time boxed sprint? Are we really not able to plan effectively for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, right? When we were doing waterfall projects, we were planning for projects that spanned across 6 to 8 to 10 months. And here, if we are not able to plan for 2 weeks, then that is a serious question, right? Apart from that, like we said, when we are doing our sprint planning, not going into enough detail, not going into enough breakdown really creates ambiguous estimates and not enough visibility on what kind of effort it would take to complete something. Now, introducing new stories towards the end of the sprint or introducing new changes during the sprint, usually they just get introduced. They never get planned, right? And how do you measure the maturity of your team, the effectiveness of your team, the efficiency of your team, unless you are really trying to look at how are we measuring up when we are executing in a time boxed sprint? Which is why it is very important that we finalize our sprint goal in a sprint planning, right? We're not planning too far ahead, right? We're just planning for the next 2 weeks. And if your product owners or your engineering managers are coming up with changes to the scope during a sprint, I'll just quickly go over the standard scope change process that I talked about. Okay, and there's a definite set of questions that need to be answered before anything new can be introduced into a sprint. The first question needs to be asked to the product owner saying, why does this have to be in the current sprint? The second question to the product owner is, what is the impact of taking this up in the next sprint as opposed to taking it up right now? Now, if both these questions are answered with a justification that this item needs to be taken up in the current sprint, then we need to go back to the team and ask, do you have enough slack to take up this additional work? Can you deliver it with your current commitments for the sprint? If not, then the question goes back to the product owner that if this is indeed a high priority for you, then for something to be prioritized, something else will need to be deprioritized. So you look at the sprint backlog and tell me, what do I deprioritize in order to create room for the high priority items? Okay, so answering these 4 questions really streamlines the scope change and helps us identify on whether or not that scope change is really required or not.
Thank you for that once again, Akshay. We have another question from Saravana. If the user's story estimate includes slack or buffer, why can't the team be committed at 100% capacity?
So that's the idea. The user story, okay, it may be estimated with slack or buffer, which ideally is not the right thing to do. Okay, what we want to do here is break it down into granular tasks. Let the team organize those tasks in terms of how do we manage it internally and how we really organize it internally and how we take it forward from an open state to a complete state, let's say, right? So usually the effort estimate for any user story incorporates completion of the tasks. Okay, and the buffer time is not really supposed to be for user story completion, but the initial 15 to 20% slack that we consider is for unprecedented defects, right? Now, defects will end up in fixing the defects, retesting the defects, and this is where the slack time is essentially supposed to be focused, right? So keeping some leg room is essential, but not as part of the effort estimate for a user story.
Right. We have a couple of more questions and we have more time, guys. So if you have, please put them in the Q&A box. So the next one we have is, how do you resolve the issue of the product owner being absent?
So that is a very good question. And absence of a product owner is difficult to resolve. And the reason why the product owners are absent is because they don't understand their role. They don't understand the importance and the gravity of their role in a Scrum team, right? And largest of all, they don't understand the benefit of their day-to-day engagement with the team. So what we need to do is help them understand what is your benefit as a product owner. How does early feedback help you, right? How does fast-paced execution help you? How does day-to-day engagement with the team help you? What benefit does it bring to the table for you, right? What we fail to do mostly is imply the benefit of the individual for any process change that we want to bring to the table. We keep preaching that this is what Scrum says, this is how we should do things, but why are we doing those things that way? What is the purpose of the change? That is something that we usually fail to bring to the table, and that's what brings these anti-patterns to the table for us. So it's imperative that we really help them understand what it's all about, what is their benefit into it, and what is the purpose of doing things differently.
Right. So I think somewhat somewhat related. How do we handle unresponsive stakeholders?
All right. So unresponsive stakeholders, first of all, that feedback needs to go to the product owner. Okay. And the product owner needs to take that feedback to stakeholders, right? Because the product owner is the person who is owning the backlog, owning the return on investment. Passive stakeholders are doing nothing but increasing investment for the product owner, right? Now, as a stakeholder, if I am increasing investment by being passive and then asking for return, then that is something that the product owner needs to push back with the stakeholders again by explaining what is the benefit of a stakeholder by being active. What is the purpose of a sprint review, right? Most of the product owners go to stakeholders and say, okay, this is what you wanted, this is what we have, come and see it, right? But the purpose of a review is to really evaluate, is what has been built something that I can start capitalizing on immediately? Or does it really reveal something that I can use for my envisioning for the future? So this is the purpose that stakeholders need to understand. And this is the benefit that they want to look at, right? If you can provide feedback early, it reduces the cost of rework. It reduces the cost of delays. Now, as we go into stakeholders with these benefits and these purposes, things fall in line. And like Pradeep said, things have to be repeated many, many times to implant these ideas into people. So handling these conversations patiently and really focusing on bringing out the purpose and benefit of what we're trying to do, that's what brings the difference.
And I would add to what Akshay said, related to the product owner and the stakeholders' roles. If in case you see situations like these, and we have seen situations like these in our programs where we are talking about transformations, these are very evident anti-patterns. And more often than not, one of the key resolution to the situation is coaching. It's I've seen people trying to just talk about approvals offline, or talk about follow-ups on emails or stuff like that. But that's not the intent. That doesn't result into what we need to have. I guess active participation and certain ownership of, let's say a product owner has to own certain responsibility for the overall benefit to maximize. And I would not blame him if he doesn't understand the importance of it, but I would rather coach him and make him understand. I guess that's the key to it.
Right. Thank you, Pradeep.
Sure.
Right. We have another question from Saravana. We see sprint O, sprint 0.1, 0.2 happening now until the scope of the release is determined. Is there a yardstick for how best to utilize the planning and exploration innovation cycles?
Okay, so first of all, sprint 0.1, 0.2 is an anti-pattern in itself. We should not be doing that. Second thing, we're not really measuring release cycles in terms of sprint yardsticks, but any deliverable from a sprint may or may not be something that delivers immediate value to the customer, right? But we need to make sure there may be sprints where we spend 2 weeks only on enablers, only on research, right? Only on learning, which is fine. But the idea behind sprint planning is to make sure that we are able to envision and account for the 2 weeks worth of effort or 3 weeks worth of effort from the team. Where are we utilizing their time? What are we doing in this time boxed interval, in this time boxed sprint? What is the team striving to achieve? It may be, learning on .NET, learning on cloud, right? The deliverable that we are going to work on has something to do with cloud. The team is not ready to work on cloud. So we dedicate a sprint for the team to learn cloud. That is fine. But 0.1, 0.2, I don't think that's the right thing to do.
And I think one of the key things about sprint planning, I mean, I've seen teams doing sprint planning, but not being enough diligent into it. So sprint planning really means that you are looking at the backlog, you're picking up the items for the sprint. And it's like when I say you means like the whole team. It's a ceremony where every individual in the team really needs to participate. And it's not the team leads or the Scrum Master or the product owner. They go out and do something and they tell about the estimates and delegate the task. It's about everyone understanding what we're trying to achieve in the sprint, how we're trying to do it, and who is going to do what sort of thing. And if there are any impediments into it, if there is more slack required in a given sprint, all of that has to come from every individual participating very, very actively into it. And doing this exercise, really, it starts from the backlog and the user stories that we want to pick up for the sprint. And the end for the sprint planning is where you have a complete breakdown and the estimates out of it. And this is how it's going to be our sprint is going to look like. So technically speaking, if you go back to the first slide that we had, where the huddle that we had, everybody running on top of each other and trying to kick off, I think that's what the sprint planning really should look like, where everybody is equally involved with 100% enthusiasm to get something done throughout the sprint. So point 1 and point 2 typically means, I would think that somebody is taking decisions unanimously rather than having everybody's participation into it. Okay.
All right. So I think Priscilla has a related question for us. How do you work with a team that don't want to do Scrum or are reluctant to ceremonies because they are architecture design team and they don't understand the business values. How do you work with a product owner who doesn't understand the business value or what the team is doing? Goals.
All right. So an architect who doesn't understand business value, but understands the value of architecture, right? This is somebody who understands the value of their own deliverables. Now, even an architect or a tech lead or a developer or a tester, in a team, everybody is going to have some dependencies on each other. And every individual is going to be delivering some contributed value to any deliverable coming from the team, right? Now, similar to our previous responses, such individuals in a team are also needed to be coached. They need to understand, right, how their absence in ceremonies or their absence in Scrum events is impacting the rest of the team, right? Now, it may not be impacting business deliverables as they see it because they don't understand the business related value, but they do understand that their contribution is going to add value to the technical teams, right? And what they are contributing towards the team is really essential for the team to understand and align on a day-to-day basis, making sure that their internal dependencies are resolved and in line with each other. So that's the kind of conversation we need to have repeatedly and help them understand the benefit and the value of their contribution in these sprint Scrum events. Because these Scrum events are essentially designed in a manner that they are able to resolve these conflicts and bring in more efficiency to the team members. So as Scrum Masters, as the owners of process, we really need to start coaching people around the purpose, the benefit, right? Everybody is going to have their own benefits. Developers are going to have some benefits from the process from their standpoint. Business has benefits from their standpoint. Similarly, architects are going to have benefits from their perspective. We need to identify those benefits and coach them on those values. Eventually, they do come to line with the process.
Right. I hope that answers your question, Priscilla. We have a couple of more questions from Gildas. How can we avoid rolling over tickets to upcoming sprints because QA isn't completed?
Start planning your sprints more effectively, sir. Right? See, the reason why that happens is because we have estimated at a high level. We have not really done effective breakdown to really look at what needs to be done. And QA doesn't finish mostly because they get developed functionality pretty late, right? That's the usual reason for why QA or testing doesn't complete in a sprint, eventually leading to the user stories rolling over to the next. So one thing is, why is the development not happening on time? What is the reason? These are items that we need to start taking up in our retrospectives, right? And identify those gaps. Are we not planning effectively, right? Are we not taking unforeseen dependencies into account? Are we not going detailed enough, leading to the development happening late, right? And even if the development is happening late or delayed by some time, are we not having enough slack time to account for that delay and still complete our sprint goal in time? These are the kind of questions we need to really bring into our retrospectives and find an answer to that instead of just going along with the flow and continuing to roll over stories to the next sprint to the next sprint.
Right. Last question of the day. That's all the time that we have. Which is best, cloning QA tickets from dev tickets or creating QA tickets as subtasks?
Okay, so first of all, where we started defining user stories. So there's supposed to be no such thing as dev tickets and QA tickets. There need to be user stories with subtasks accounting to everything that needs to be done to take that story and have it qualify the definition of done, right? Now it is going to have subtasks for design, subtasks for coding, subtasks for code review, subtasks for testing, subtasks for UAT, subtasks for product owner review, and finally, as it qualifies the definition of done, that is where the story gets completed. But the user story needs to be a functional piece of functionality that delivers value instead of being dev and QA tickets.
In fact, I'll add to that point. One of the key things about when we are defining user stories, by and large, I've seen, when people are defining user stories, they look at it more like a task. But user story has a very, very different definition. It's, if you would, from an analogy standpoint, or let's say, if you want to visualize it, it's like a user story is something which can be tested independently. A user story is something which delivers a piece of complete functionality, something that can be called as a function in the product. User story is something, a good user story is something which really horizontally slices all the skills that exist in the team. So if you have a UI team and a backend team and a QA and a business analyst and let's say automation or a database, a good user story is where it has got a component of everything into it. It's not a mandate, but it's one good guideline. If most of your user stories are centered around one skill in the project or in the team, then I think that needs to be, that's an anti-pattern, let's put it that way. We shouldn't be having that scenario all the time. And that's why this question, when we are saying QA tickets and dev tickets, it's coming because we are looking at them as two different units. But as a part of the Scrum team, they are the same unit. It's just one unit of team. And any user story should actually slice through both the teams at the same time. All right.
So we'll just squeeze in one last question. Can meticulous Scrum documentation play a major role for detecting anti-pattern?
So meticulous Scrum documentation, well, the Agile Manifesto says that we want to value working software over comprehensive documentation. Okay, so we don't want to document a lot. We want to document only what's required, right? Documentation is not really going to help us identify anti-patterns. Behaviors are, right? Scrum is a very behavior-driven methodology that doesn't really rely on documentation for assessing progress or assessing maturity. It relies on behaviors, right? How the team is behaving, how is the team maturing, what kind of what kind of a complexity thought process do they have around the technology they're working on, the product they're working on. Story point estimation, for example, right? If today in a refinement, there is a user story that I say is a 5-point complexity. 4 sprints down the line, a similar story comes my way and I say it's a 3-point complexity. That's where story points tell me that I've grown. I have matured with the technology. I've matured with the product because it's not as complex to me anymore, right? So it's not really driven by documentation, but more by behavior. And that's where we need to focus our attention and resolve it from that perspective.
All right. Thank you, Akshay, and thank you, Pradeep, once again. This is all that we have for you today. I hope today's session was interesting, and I can sense that considering quite a few questions have come today. And before we sign off for the day, I wanted to let you guys know that we're having a very interesting webinar coming up on GPT-3 industry use cases. GPT-3 is a language model that leverages deep learning to generate human-like text, a very hot topic in the area of natural language processing. This one is one that you really don't want to miss. So I'll be sending invites to all of you. So until next time, folks, thank you once again for joining us today. And thank you once again, Akshay. Thank you, Pradeep.
Thanks, Pranshul. Thanks, everyone, for joining in.
Thanks, Pranshu, and thanks, everyone.
It was fun talking to everyone.
Yeah, it was a great evening. Thank you so much, everyone.